Now, your takeaway in terms of the nature of a transatlantic relationship?
It's very strained. It has to be said.
People thought I would use force. I don't have to use force. I don't want to use force. I won't use force. All the United States is asking for is a place called Greenland.
We've just heard President Trump's speech, and it was, as some people predicted, conciliatory, you might say, or at least it was a declaration that he isn't going to invade Greenland, Denmark, Iceland. This is good news. But the general mood here is one of incredible tension, alienation, bewilderment, surprise, confusion, anguish, pain. I mean, I have dealt with some of the Trump people these days, and it is very hard work to handle them. They are very, very aggressive. It's just professionally difficult to do. And I think that sense is running across everyone here. And it is specifically the Europeans, I think. Canadians being counted as an extension of Europe in this sense.
Yeah.
Trump singled out Mark Carney for obvious reasons because of his powerful speech and his obvious seriousness having been to Beijing. It's very tense.
Europe clearly has to fix its key issues: the lack of growth, the lack of GDP per capita growth, and the three pillars of our strategy in order to deliver more sovereignty, more efficiency and more growth would be based on protection, simplification and investment.
We've been hearing speeches coming from the European leaders, whether it is the EU commissioner or it is the French president, and the list goes on. Now, do you see there's any consensus among them?
It really is. I think we heard from the people who spoke up vocally a kind of unanimity, which is not that we aren't willing to talk with the United States about what America's interests in Greenland are, but an absolute refusal of coercion, whether it's by means of tariffs, let alone by military means, as a way of addressing those concerns. That, I think, is the bottom line on the European side. No coercion, no violence. Amongst somebody that you think of as your allies, between you and your allies, there cannot be that mode of interaction. And the Trump administration finds that hard to deal with because they actually they like the bullying element. It's more and more clear from every interaction that you have that that's a key part of their policy. So I think that is a bottom line. But it is notable we haven't heard from everyone in the same way, and the central problem of concerting European opinion remains. The big issue for Europe, it has to be said, is Ukraine. This is the key issue. The national security concern of the East remains the abiding European preoccupation. I think it explains Europe's policy throughout this first year of the second Trump administration. And that's where you will also see very considerable differences. And the willingness, therefore, of people to compromise or stand relatively firm depends on that.
Talking about that, it's very interesting to see the European list of things urgent to deal with the United States. It's getting ever longer.
Yes.
For example, it's, as you said, Ukraine, there's also Greenland, and there's tariff, and there are many other things.
Digital regulations.
Exactly. So what does that mean for the Europeans? Is the United States already exerting enough pressure for the Europeans to crack?
Well, I think actually what we've seen, the optimistic reading, is that it's exerting enough pressure for the Europeans to consolidate. And I don't regret President Trump telling us that he's not going to invade Greenland. That is a considerable source of relief. I never thought I'd say that, but I feel relieved. But what I worry about is that having disappeared as a threat, that the energy that we were seeing in the couple of days will begin to ebb away. And that, I think, will be really regrettable, because everyone who has watched this relationship, since, you could say, even the Obama period, because Obama was a professional international politician, but he was cool on Europe. Cool. The first Trump administration should have been the wake-up call. I think, unfortunately, the Biden administration, which was classically Atlanticist, put the Europeans back to sleep. And now they're waking up again. And I think this is a tendency, this has got to be something we have to fight. Europe has to understand the need to stand on its own 2 feet. It will, in fact, be better for its relations, I think, both with the United States and with China, if Europe is stabilized as a single coherent actor, able to clearly state and rationally argue for its interests.
Yeah. Let's take a look at what has happened since the earlier few months ago. First of all, there was the Munich Security Conference last year, famously for the divorce between the United States and Europe. And then we also see the national security paper coming out of Washington, describing European continents probably has an even more threat than some of the other earlier believed the so-called rivals.
Yeah.
So, and now we are seeing the World Economic Forum related to Greenland and other topics. So how do you see the evolution of this discussion and also the interaction between the two sides?
What is fascinating is that this is a kind of multi-stranded push. And what we saw at Munich was led by Vice President Vance. And Vance, for me, stands for a cultural revolution, a culture war politics, which he took very aggressively to Munich. It was basically an accusation against mainstream European parties that they marginalized the far-right parties that the MAGA Trump people feel themselves aligned with. So it was a kind of line struggle across transatlantically, with Vance demanding more space for his political friends. That ran through the whole year and manifested very loudly in the national security strategy, which downplayed ideological divides, conflicts between the United States and China or with Russia. It sort of took those for granted. Different systems, different rules, different ideologies, okay. But with Europe, it's different, because the MAGA campaign in the US, which does think of itself as kind of pushing a cultural revolution, understands that it has no business talking about Chinese politics or Russian politics. But Europe is the extension and the echo chamber, and places like Davos quintessentially are zones where liberal Americans, the professional managerial class of America, goes for inspiration, consolidates its values, learns from the Europeans, and vice versa. And we've seen Gavin Newsom here, who's clearly in his element, John Kerry, that entire old guard of American liberalism. Al Gore comes back every year. This is their stomping ground. And the MAGA people quite correctly sense that confronting Europe is part of their domestic political struggle. And then there's Greenland, and no one really knows. Where Greenland comes from is something out of the geopolitical imagination of, I believe, the president himself. It's very difficult to get anyone on the president's team to talk seriously about it, because I don't think they really understand either.
However, the issue of energy is for real.
Yes.
How do you see the element of energy, lifeline for Europe to prosper, played in this transatlantic relationship, for now at least?
Oil for the Europeans is a stable thing. Europe has been saturated with oil for decades. It's not a booming market. We're really talking about electricity generation. And so we're talking about the trade-off really between gas, wind, solar, and batteries.
Right.
Those are the real options. And what the Europeans realized during the Ukraine conflict is the dependence on pipelined Russian gas was very risky for them because of the geopolitics. And there was a lurch towards two things: accelerate renewables, solar and wind, in using large quantities of Chinese solar panels to do the solar build out. Wind is different, that's done more domestically, and buying American LNG. And the president, with his pro-American oil and gas producers hat on, is a export gas president. He goes around the world doing these giant LNG deals, and the Europeans side up to one. The problem is that he's also a low energy cost for American consumers president, which is totally in conflict with his commitment to the interests of the American oil producers. And so with that hat on, he's let's go and take control of Venezuelan oil and pump that into the market and help to bring oil prices down. And so there's as with so many things in the Trump project, there's these deep contradictions between his commitment to energy dominance and what does it really mean? Does that mean cheap energy for American consumers or big markets for American producers? Opening up the big market for American producers might reduce the pressure on the American market, but there's very little coherence in his thinking about these basic issues, which is not just a Trump problem. It's a conflict inherent in America's situation, which is that it is a oil power and a gas power, both as a producer and a consumer. And that puts you constantly in conflict with yourself.
But the question really is, how is Europe likely as a continent to deal with the choking point of energy supply?
The solution is new energy types. I mean, that's the direction. They made promises to Trump, they're not going to keep them. The promises they made to Trump are really, I thought this was us, the Europeans, engaging in fake news, because there's no central gas purchasing agency in Europe that can say, yes, we will buy hundreds of billions of dollars of American gas. European firms, European generators decide how much gas they take. So the actual solution is going to be a renewable build out.
Another question is the arms race. So how is this branch of issues, which we do not discuss often, just say a year ago, now becomes such an important component of the overall picture in terms of business interests?
They're very considerable. And in urgency, I think that's the crucial thing. We're not really talking about big business. Once upon a time, you would have said the military-industrial complex was a large piece of the global economy. Nowadays, compared to big tech or the really big banks, it's small scale. But it's crucial for national security. It's crucial for survival. And at the high end, it intersects with technologies like AI and cloud security when you suddenly get into the really big budgets. But what we are seeing is a scramble, and this goes to the question that preoccupies so much of the West, is our diminished ability to make things. And the explosive quality of that question is that China, of course, has emerged as the dominant manufacturing power of the 21st century. And so you see this national security anxiety, fear about deindustrialization, the realization that China is the absolutely dominant manufacturing power, and then an argument within the politics of both Europe and America, we heard it from the president, about how you handle the distributional costs of a big armaments ramp up. I mean, Trump has been talking about 1.5 trillion, crazy numbers, he likes the big numbers, but more seriously, the Germans are pushing the share of defense spending in their GDP towards 4% quite systematically, and that will generate a very substantial new market. The problem for the Europeans is, as always, can they agree to do it together? Or are we going to get a series of rivalrous projects, or are we going to get projects which are ultimately dependent on American technology for the really high-end stuff, which is missiles?
We have been seeing some interesting signs in rhetorics, at least. For example, about the Anti-Coercion Act.
Yes.
For example, about technology sovereignty. For example, about whether to purchase or not technologies coming from the US that might have a huge impact on European security, or vice versa, whether Europeans want to share those technologies, drones, for example, with the United States. So what do you make of these, shall I say, flowing on the surface suggestions?
Yes.
Are they really serious, or are they just tricks being thrown out for negotiation's sake?
I mean, I think that they are negotiating ploys, but as in any relationship, the harder the talk, the more aggressive the talk, the more deeper values begin to erode. And I think we are definitely at the point now where that tactical moving, the kind of aggressive actions that people are showing and the rhetoric that's being deployed is eating away at the trust which underpins the entire relationship. You cannot describe your relations, say, as the Americans have with the Europeans in recent weeks, without fundamentally undermining the willingness of other people to work with you. And you could see the shock in President Macron of France, when he said it would be crazy if the anti-coercion instrument, which was intended for use against Russia and, let's face it, against China, over rare earths, for instance, that's what the Europeans imagined coercion to look like, if it would have to be actually used for the first time against the United States. And that level of kind of disbelief almost is beginning to move through the European system and change attitudes in quite a deep way.
Having said that, though, whether those so-called suggestions is going to resolve the crisis you are facing today, I mean, the Europeans are facing today, it's a big question. You have very long legal process.
Yes.
And you need to have all the capitals to agree on that.
Yes.
And also you need to have enough next step to deal with if there were actually reactions coming from Washington. Yes. So have Europeans been thinking about all of these every step of the way, or this is just, let's talk about this?
Europe is a very unusual thing in that it's a political system that is making itself up in history. It is not simply a given thing, but something that has to be created. And as one famous European, Jean Monnet, said, Europe is the series of answers we have given to the crisis that we have collectively faced. And what we're seeing on defense with Ukraine and the threat of American withdrawal from Europe is a sudden willingness on the part of all of the key players in Europe to consider, for instance, common financing by debt of military spending. And those are the sorts of moves to look for. In this kind of ratchet, there are crucial thresholds which you cross, and when you cross them, it changes the game. It started with COVID, and it has now moved to anti-coercion instruments. It is now moving to common funding of defense. And those are the moves to trace in real time.
Yeah.
What Europe isn't is simply a fixed polity with a clear shape. That doesn't mean that it's not capable of developing in very, very powerful ways.
Right. Look at this year, it's the midterm election.
Yes.
I'm sure the European leaders are looking at their own agenda while they're comparing the notes of their American counterparts.
Well, I think one thing you're worried about is definitely the question of whether MAGA, Trump's movement, is going to win vindication in the American midterms. The big European hope, and they will all be praying before bedtime every night, is that Trump receives a devastating verdict in November. This will be the big hope. I think that is really a weak way of responding to the situation. They have a lot of problems at home, political problems at home. One of the big questions is going to be about the future of mainstream politics in France and in Germany and in Britain, where opinion polling in all three countries is showing very, very strong nationalist movements.
Yeah.
And in the background of many of the conversations that you're hearing in a place like Davos amongst the Europeans here is not just what's happening in America, but how that might come here.
Right.
What will happen if it's Le Pen that's representing France here in due course? What happens if it's Nigel Farage speaking for Britain? What happens is we don't even know who it would be for the AfD as part of a German government. This will be a transformed world. So I think that's another concern that they have. The other urgency for Europe is economic growth. They've seen a very serious slowdown in overall growth, notably at the heart of Europe in Germany, which is feeling what they think of as a second China shock from the incredible surge in Chinese manufacturing capacity, the successes of Made in China 2025, which ironically I learned is a program that the Chinese borrowed from the Germans, which was Industry 4.0, which was launched at Davos by Schwab. And China typically was the one country that took it very, very seriously and is changing the world as a result. So that is also, I think, a really profound concern for, and you heard this in Macron's speech as well. He said, look, the one thing we have to focus on is growth.
Can I ask you fundamentally some of the issues between the United States and Europe? Look at what happened after World War II. Especially the financial structure, the currency, the treasury debts. All of these are going to the fundamental of this relationship and also the American leadership in the world.
I mean, I think there's a nostalgia for that older, simpler world. And it was renewed in 1989 with the common victory of NATO over the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And so those two phases were decisive in reconsolidating the transatlantic link. But I think the honest truth is that over decades, our societies have developed in very different directions. None of them are uniform. America is a hugely diverse place. The part of America I live in, New York, is in many ways quite European feeling still, or very global. That's not true of a large part of the country where Trump gets his votes from. But it is changing very, very dramatically. And it is overdue, I think, for Europe to understand the need for a basic reevaluation of where we're at. And it would be horrible to think that it would take a shock like war to force us to do that. These references back to World War II, I think, are historically relevant, but that cannot be our vision of where we go next. We must find it within ourselves. And I think the examples being offered here, notably by Mark Carney, this constructive vision of a world change, which is basically multipolar, which broadly speaking means global development has succeeded and we should celebrate it, an adjustment in European politics to take advantage, to embrace that fact, is really overdue.
But think about it, Professor. Euro was years ago in competition against the dollar.
Yeah.
And a lot of households all over the world, they were not buying gold at that moment.
Yes.
They were changing their currency into euro.
Yes.
So where is euro now? How is it likely to be its role in the overall cross-Atlantic negotiations and discussions?
So I think in the early 2000s, shortly after the euro was introduced, there was that sense that they would be competitive currencies. But the reality of European banking, and you see that very well represented at Davos, is that it was always a transatlantic affair. The dollar remains for banks, whether they're in Switzerland or Paris or Frankfurt or London.
We heard the bankers talking about that in that sense.
They're in dollars, right? And so when the financial crisis of 2008 happened, that was one point which sucked all of the European banks back into dependence on the Fed. And then the second thing was the crisis of the Eurozone, which shaped all of Europe's policymakers in the 2010s, which again demonstrated the fact that there really is only one game in town in the West in terms of currency politics. What we're seeing now, though, is a quite extraordinary development, is Christine Lagarde, the extraordinarily experienced Bank president, formerly of the IMF, formerly of French finance ministry, taking responsibility for gathering all the central bankers of the Western world, I believe, to express solidarity for Jerome Powell, the governor, the chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve, in his defense against the Trump administration. And that is you could say, a kind of demonstration of both a shift in power balance, but also Europe's urgent need to stabilize the United States as the anchor of the only system that Europe knows so far. For Europe to be truly an independent player, it would need a radically different fiscal constitution. It would need debt markets that are as deep as the American debt markets. We are decades away from that, even if the Europeans chose to go down that route.
The EU recently have been having one of the largest trade pact in history. And look at those economies. They are, so to speak, in the backyard of the United States and in the middle of what the US described as so-called Western Hemisphere, according to the recent national security paper.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's important to say that this new version of the Monroe Doctrine is obviously grotesque. I mean, it's an entirely inappropriate claim to authority and power of the United States over the Western Hemisphere. And even if they can make it stick against the Venezuela, they can't make it work against a Mexico or a Brazil. Argentina is in such bad shape that Milei is quite heavily dependent on Trump, but that's because they're in crisis. I don't need to tell you that Brazil's major trading partner is not Europe or the United States, but China. The same for Chile, the same for much of Latin America now, thanks to the very constructive, heavily investment-driven policy that China has pursued. I think Europe thinks of itself as catching up with China, and all of them are basically just ignoring the silly noise coming out about Monroe doctrines from the United States. No one can take it seriously. It's absurd. If America was seriously interested in Latin America, it would have had a Latin American investment, trade policy, a migration policy to actually open up that corridor and make it powerful and generative. NAFTA with Mexico would not just be a trade deal. It would be like the EU. It would be a Schengen area. None of that, right? So the United States has failed in the historic opportunity of actually building a cultural, political, social unit out of the Western Hemisphere. And so not surprisingly, China as the great source of demand for raw materials and Europe as the great rich market are also opening their doors. How much will come out of this? It's hard to tell because there's a lot of trade already. And the real missed opportunity is trade within Latin America. It's the fact that Brazilians and the Argentinians barely trade with each other. That's the real problem for them, I would say. Where we could go next, and von der Leyen mentioned this, is India. And the big trade deal would be a EU-India, the mother of all trade deals, right? That would be, it would be India-EU.
Yeah. I will travel to India. There's still work to do, but we are on the cusp of a historic trade agreement. Indeed, some call it the mother of all deals.
That would be it's a complex trade deal. Indians are not easy to do trade deals with. They are co-responsible for paralyzing WTO. And there's such a huge income differential between Europe and India that any kind of tight integration would be quite difficult to achieve. Right. But it's steps in the right direction for sure. And I think that is the future. Those sorts of bilateral, multilateral, but not fully comprehensive deals.
Final question. Where is Europe, especially the EU countries, in terms of global governance? When we say that, we talk about the United Nations, of course, the geopolitics, and we also talk about WTO and some of the other international platforms. Where is Europe going to be as a result of all of this we're seeing today?
It was such an interesting contrast between Ursula von der Leyen's speech and the Chinese Vice Prime Minister who came and spoke here. And they spoke back to back. And China's voice is strongly multilateral. It's strongly global governance. It's strongly commitment to those organizations.
Every point he made is about that.
Every point. So it was so purposeful. And what was interesting is that Europe's position, I think, is broadly in sympathy with that. But the point they have to prove is they can stand up for themselves, right? For so long, they've been caricatured as just being about global rules, that there's almost a reaction now in Europe that they have to show they can do vigorous, we can't do national, but EU politics. De facto, though, and you can see this in the EU's trade disputes with China, which are numerous. The Europeans again and again and again refer back to the WTO principles. They are not in the American space of just free for all, whatever the president thinks. They would like, say over electric vehicles, to debate the technical issues of the levels of subsidy they accuse China of providing. And they have provided evidence and they want to be in part of that conversation. And I think that suggests fundamentally a willingness on the part of the Europeans to uphold that structure, which is potentially the scope for a bargain also with Beijing.